All right. Welcome everyone to this week's webinar offering. Today we are going to be discussing the organic acids test as the second in my series on favorite at-home functional medicine screening tests. Before we get into that particular subject, just wanted to repeat again the financial disclosure that I mentioned last week and provide a little bit of an update on the COVID-19 situation. Again, this refers to confirmed cases. They have definitely bumped up in the past week. These are worldwide numbers, 3.67 million total confirmed cases. Encouragingly, the confirmed fatality rate has held steady at 6.9%. As we discussed last week, however, this is probably a gross overestimation of what the actual fatality rate of this infectious process really is. I did come across this very interesting depiction of the spread of this particular virus and how it evolves as time goes by and it spreads throughout the world. You can see the purple is clearly where it began in Wuhan, China, and then as it spread from December onward and moved to different parts of the world, it has mutated. Now, I have seen some research that has talked about how this particular virus is not mutating quite as quickly as influenza seems to mutate. But clearly, this has only been about 5 months or so that scientists have been looking at this. It is mutating, and there are different versions of this virus that are beginning to express throughout the world. Now, this research has been made possible because of the actual process of sequencing the genome. This graph refers to the cost to sequence a human genome, and you can see back in 2001, that was as much as $100 million per genome to sequence. Now we're down somewhere closer to about $1,000, probably less than that in all honesty, just because technology keeps advancing and things that used to be more technology intense to perform 1 to 20 years ago are becoming easier and easier as time goes on. Part of this is also due to the fact that the human genome is quite a bit more information to catalog than the actual SARS-CoV-2 genome. We're talking about 5 orders of magnitude difference between the two genomes. Humans, of course, have DNA. This virus is an RNA virus, so it's only one strand. Not that that matters too much, but again, really just the sheer magnitude of information that we're talking about. So it's quite a bit easier to sequence this genome, to do so quickly, and to stay on top of the changes as they emerge as different samples are collected. This is another way of looking at this evolution of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Back in December, as depicted by the purple, it was really just sort of one strain that emerged, but it has spread and changed. These colors are representative of the colors that we saw previously on that map as the virus has continued to evolve. The red color being the strain that has been most dominant here in the United States, but if this pattern holds true, it will probably continue to evolve at more micro levels in different regions throughout particular countries that are assessed. This was an interesting study that I just saw. It was published by Reuters on the 30th of April, basically saying that GI symptoms are actually quite common in US COVID-19 patients. Almost 2/3 of American patients with COVID-19 have at least one GI symptom. Anorexia, which is basically lack of hunger, was the most common of these, but diarrhea and nausea were also quite common. Interestingly, those with anorexia and nausea were also most likely to have anosmia and ageusia. Those are your two fancy words for the day: loss of smell and loss of taste, which have been mentioned seemingly more and more in the news of late. Those with diarrhea as the primary GI complaint, less likely to have the loss of smell and taste as part of their overall symptom picture. GI symptoms in the US were the initial symptom in 14% of patients and the predominant symptom in 20% of patients. And interestingly as well, those with GI symptoms seem to have lower incidence of ICU admission and death overall relative to those without the GI symptoms. I would say also interestingly that this was a study that was performed in Massachusetts. It was undertaken by scientists at Harvard, and it looked at 2 tertiary care hospitals in Massachusetts. That's basically the most advanced level of hospital, something like Mass Gen or Bay State, for example, are both tertiary care hospitals, as well as 7 community hospitals. So those would be the least capable of handling, the really extreme, severe pathologies. Okay, so moving on to today's topic of conversation, the organic acids test. This is a very complex panel of tests. The intro course to go over this for practitioners who wish to use it, just the intro course is 8 hours in and of itself to help orient doctors to how to make use of this test. The advanced course, which really digs into all the nuts and bolts and nuances of what can be discerned by running this test, is over 25 hours of additional material. Today, we're just going to be talking about the highlights. We really could spend a couple of days going through this in its entirety. Also, I just want to say that there are a lot of terms, markers on this panel of tests that have very intense sounding chemistry names, as I called it. Don't be discouraged by that. Don't get too hung up on the details of the naming conventions. Just let the information sort of wash over you. More important is to take note of the value that this test can provide to you in terms of helping to get to the root cause level of what might be causing whatever the complaint is that has brought about the suggestion that this test be run. So what is the organic acids test? It is really essentially an accurate assessment of what is happening metabolically in the body. This is a panel of tests looking at urinary metabolite levels. Now, these are organic acids themselves, and they're linked to various disorders. These can be imbalances that point to specific treatments that can then be undertaken based on what's seen in this test and confirmed in their effectiveness. The treatments can be confirmed in their effectiveness by repeating the organic acids test. Another way of saying all of this is that it's a way to assess allostatic load. Now, that's a fancy sounding term, but it essentially means the wear and tear on the body. As one of my teachers called it, it's the price of accommodation. Basically how the body is able to continue to express health as optimally as possible. And it comes about because of repeated stresses or because of chronic stress. And that could be essentially the same type of stressful impulse that just hasn't ever really been corrected. The term itself comes from the word allostasis, which is the process of achieving homeostasis, or another way of saying that is the ability to achieve stability through change. Homeostasis is maybe something that you have heard of before. It's basically the steady state of conditions that are maintained by an organism or a living system. We can think of that in terms of internal state of condition, so fluid balances, physical state of condition, temperature, blood pressure, for example, or chemical conditions, the acidity or alkalinity, the pH, concentrations of ions, blood sugar, things like that. There are a lot of contributors to allostatic load, really more than we can list here on this one page. If you attended the webinar last week, there was that whole page that I put up with all of the potential causes of dysbiosis, and it was 2 columns, and that didn't even encompass the totality of what could contribute. Similar sort of thing here. But those that are specifically assessed on the OAT, for example, would be exposure to mold toxins environmentally, intestinal dysbiosis, something that we spoke about extensively last week on the comprehensive stool analysis. That could be because of yeast, or it could be because of bacteria. Others, neurotransmitter imbalances, mitochondrial dysfunction, and nutritional inadequacy. But ultimately, we're talking about organic acids here. So what are organic acids? They are, as I mentioned earlier, products of metabolism. That's another way of saying basically the biochemistry that's happening in the body everywhere, all the time. And these are essentially waste products that need to then be removed from the body. And typically this is done by excreting them in the urine. The term organic is applied because carbon and hydrogen are always present in these molecules, and they may also contain oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, or phosphorus as well. Here are a couple of examples. Most everybody's probably heard of lactic acid. Probably, unless you're a biochemist, you haven't heard of HPHPA. Again, on the panel that I tend to use with my patients, there are 77 different markers that are looked at. So these are just a couple of examples. Each specific value that is assessed can be related to lots of different biochemical functions in the body and can be elevated or decreased for lots of different reasons. So that gives you some sense of the overall complexity of the OAT. There are many different influences on the production of organic acids. Here are some. These different influences, again, can either raise the level of a particular organic acid, lower the particular level, or help to promote a more ideal sort of Goldilocks, middle of the road value, which is what we'd hope to see on every single value for a patient. Now, to really talk a little bit more, not to get too granular about it, we do need to go over the concept of enzymes. Enzymes are essentially proteins that help to facilitate the speed with which a biochemical reaction happens. That can be increased by a factor of 1 millionfold or more. Essentially, what these enzymes are doing is breaking chemical bonds or helping to form chemical bonds. Now, there are more nuanced and subtle sort of sub-variations on these two themes, but by and large, that's what we're talking about. We're going to break bonds or we're going to form bonds. Some enzymes require the presence of cofactors. This was basically just an extra ingredient that needs to go into the mix in order for that bond to be broken or formed. This can be as simple as an actual atom, something like magnesium or zinc, which is one of the reasons why it's important to eat a healthy diet that has appropriate amounts of these key nutrients in it. It's one of the reasons why I basically recommend magnesium for almost everybody, because we just don't get enough in our diet in the 21st century. But cofactors can also be much larger than just a simple atom. They can be whole molecules, and that's in fact what a lot of vitamins are, these important cofactors that facilitate key enzymatic reactions throughout the body. Enzymes' activity can be inhibited as well. That's another key important piece to understand as we start to look at the OAT. This is basically a decrease in the enzyme activity. It can be an outright just obstruction so that the activity doesn't happen. It can happen in a competitive fashion, which is what's depicted in the top picture. It can happen in a non-competitive fashion. There are other variations on that as well, but by and large, that's what we're talking about. We don't need to get too worked up about that, but just to know that their activity can be reduced or obstructed altogether is an important part of this puzzle to put into place. Now, the idea with the OAT is that it's kind of like an automobile emissions test. If we look at the top half of this picture, when things are working well and we have all the necessary ingredients, we can essentially take product A and turn it into product B by way of the action of enzyme AB, and so on and so forth down to product D at the end. And the body, in its inherent wisdom, is able to self-regulate and maintain appropriate balances of all of these different products so that health is optimally expressed. Now, when we look at the bottom half of this picture, we can see that, for example, there's a problem with enzyme AB, and that can be because of a nutritional deficiency. So again, referring back to the need for some enzymes to have a cofactor. If we aren't getting enough magnesium or zinc, for example, in our diet, we may not have enough cofactor for a given enzyme to be able to work optimally. So we end up with an overabundance of product A, and we end up with an inadequate amount of products B, C, and or D. Now, this could also be due to a genetic variation, basically the genetic sequence that codes for this particular enzyme could have had a mutation. And that leads to an enzyme that doesn't function quite as optimally as the ideal would function. It could also be due to, for example, dysbiosis, an unfavorable mix of bacteria in the gut and what they produce. And that could result in the production of an inhibiting agent that blocks the activity of that enzyme. Again, this is a very high level view of this. The idea is that we want all of our enzymes to be working as well as possible. We want them not to be blocked. We want them to have all of their necessary ingredients so that all of the various compounds that our body needs to express health are present in appropriate amounts. So who would the OAT test be a good choice for? Basically, any individual that has any sort of chronic health complaint due to suspected metabolic toxins, biochemical imbalances, broadly speaking. Some examples of what that might look like in a definitive diagnostic pathology sort of stamped individual would be someone with autism, ADD, ADHD, any autoimmune disorder, chronic fatigue, digestive problems, mental health problems, neurologic disorders. But this is really just a sampling. This is not a complete or exhaustive list. We can think back as well, I mentioned this last week, to the idea of conventional medical practices and the idea of a screening lab. So if you go see your primary care doctor once a year just for a wellness check, they're going to order, for example, a complete blood count, a complete metabolic panel. They might check your thyroid or take a look at your cholesterol just to screen for, is anything, amiss here that might need some further evaluation and or treatment. Now, these tests can also be used specifically in the setting of a given complaint. Oh, gosh, I feel a little sick, a little run down. Well, let's get a CBC and let's check your white count to see if you have an infection. And then we can do something about that with that information. By the same measure, functional medicine has its own screening labs. Now, we talked about the comprehensive stool analysis last week. We're talking about the organic acids test this week. There are others, but it's the same idea. We can just sort of run this proactively in a preventative sort of fashion, or we can run it with specific complaints in mind, wanting to gain further objective data for their specific insights that provides. The organic acids test is not as widely offered by different functional medicine companies as the CSA that we talked about last week was. There's really two that I'm aware of, Great Plains Laboratory and Genova. Genova calls theirs the organics. I generally order the Great Plains Laboratory version of this because it is, frankly, it's just better in my opinion. It checks a lot of additional values. Now, there are some values on the Genova version that aren't checked on the Great Plains, but by and large, I find the Great Plains Laboratory to be the better of the two choices. Again, these are urine tests, so it's an at-home collection, gets frozen, it gets FedEx back to the lab, and then they, run it through all of their screening parameters to come up with the results that they provide. The pricing, again, is going to be somewhat variable depending upon, whether you have insurance that will cooperate in paying for this testing. Of course, there needs to be a medical necessity for ordering the test, unless you just want to order it and pay for it yourself out of pocket. That's also possible. At the upper end of the spectrum, you're looking at about $400 if it's exclusively on you, the patient, to pay for it. If insurance cooperates as maximally as we would hope that they would, it can be more like $150 to $200 in expense. So here, all of these examples from the report come from the Great Plains Laboratory version, because again, that's the one that I tend to recommend for my patients. This is page 1. These are a look at the first 18 values that are assessed on the OAT. Again, the Great Plains Laboratory version looks at 77 markers in total. That's where it is currently. They may add additional markers as time goes on, but this core grouping of 77, we're not going to look at all of them. It's just too much. We're going to mention some highlights. It really does provide a very comprehensive look at what is going on under the hood, so to speak, biochemically, metabolically in the individual. So here are some of the things that I would take a look at, taking a look at this first page. So in terms of environmental mold exposure, we have a good 5 values here, just right at the top, to assess, to get a sense of whether or not there might be environmental mold. This is by no means a comprehensive look at the impact on environmental mold in a given individual. Great Plains does actually have an additional urinary test called the mycotox, which is a great choice to run if there is a strong suspicion for environmental mold in a given individual. But this is sort of an initial step to get a sense of that. If we weren't even thinking that, and we get this test back and these markers are really, really high, that might be something to consider as a second step. We also get a good look at intestinal yeast, Candida. If the arabinose is very, very high, as it is on this sample report, that is strongly suggestive of the presence of yeast in the intestine, and arabinose in particular is linked with invasive yeast and all of the potential problems that can imply for the health of the intestinal barrier and the crossover into systemic repercussions, again, as we talked about last week extensively on the CSA webinar. Now we also get some non-specific markers for dysbiosis, markers 10 through 13, as well as for the presence of beneficial bacteria, marker 14. So, this is not specific, and if we wanted to gain more specific detail about, the particular species of bacteria, how robustly they were present, that would require taking a look at the stool itself, again, as we talked about last week on the CSA. And then very important with this test in particular, markers of Clostridium species of bacteria. Now these are some of what I call the bad actor bacteria by and large. There are a lot of different species of Clostridium. Not all of them are so-called bad actors. We need everything, but we want everything to be in an appropriate balance. And when some of these species become out of balance, and that can happen for lots of different reasons, then we can see evidence of that by the overproduction of some of these organic acids here on this first page of the GPL OAT. These two in particular, markers 16 and 17, are particularly concerning when they are robustly elevated. Now I should say it doesn't matter too much for this discussion, but you can see this orange bar with a vertical line down the middle. That's essentially one standard deviation away from the vertical bar in the middle, which is the mean value for these markers for the overall population of patients that have been looked at. Once you get out into the horizontal single line, that is within 1 to 2 standard deviations away from the average, and then past that additional vertical bar, whether too high or too low, that is beyond 2 standard deviations. So that helps us know the relative significance of a given value for a given patient's particular marker. Now, Clostridium can be very impactful, and there's a little bit of research actually going as far back as 1957 that was really just a case study. There was a group of mentally ill patients that seemed to excrete much larger amounts of HPA. That was, again, this marker 16 here on the Clostridium section of the OAT. That seemed to excrete much larger amounts than most normal people. And again, bear in mind, this is from 1957. Most patients with mental retardation excrete very low amounts of HPA. At that time, the researchers didn't really know what to make of it other than to just say, wow, we noticed this finding. But we can take a look at what is happening. And this is why I presented that whole area with enzymes and how they can be facilitated and why they are important to bear in mind as we think about the progression of one molecule to the next biochemically. When things are working well, we can see here that we start with this product phenylalanine, and it can go in several different pathways. When there aren't too many of these different Clostridial species, on the right, the various of the different types of bad actors, and on the left, Clostridium difficile in particular, phenylalanine, by and large, will either proceed to the right to form DHPPA, which is that marker of beneficial bacteria that we saw in the dysbiosis section earlier, or it will go to the left over to tyrosine, dopa, down to dopamine, and from there will either become HVA, just below dopamine, or proceed over to the right by way of an enzyme known as dopamine beta hydroxylase, which converts dopamine into norepinephrine, ultimately into epinephrine and the final metabolite VMA. So when we don't have too many of these Clostridial species, dopamine beta hydroxylase does what it's supposed to do, and we get an appropriate balance of these two neurotransmitter metabolites, HVA and VMA. We also end up with appropriate amounts of DHPPA, which show that we have good beneficial bacteria present in the gut. Now, when we have too many of these Clostridial species, they become active and they actually sort of siphon off some of that phenylalanine and produce either 4-cresol or HPHPA, which are those two particular significant compounds that we see on that first page of the OAT. And these two compounds both inhibit the activity of the enzyme dopamine beta hydroxylase. So what we end up with is, depending on how many of the beneficial bacteria we have, we may have a greater or lesser amount of DHPPA in the top right. But by and large, we get most of this phenylalanine turning into 4-cresol, HPHPA, and then going down to dopamine. Now, because of the presence of 4-cresol and HPHPA, dopamine beta hydroxylase's activity is blocked. So we can't convert dopamine into norepinephrine and ultimately into epinephrine and VMA. We end up with an overabundance of dopamine, which shows up as an overabundance of its metabolite, HVA. There was a very interesting study in 2010 which showed a large amount of HPHPA found in the urine samples of children with autism in much higher concentrations than age and sex-matched control subjects. Anecdotally, it was assessed objectively, but it was basically an N of 1. The highest value of HPHPA was seen in a sample that was 300 times the median normal adult value. This was found in a patient with acute schizophrenia, and the sample was collected during an acute psychotic episode in this individual. The individual was then given an oral antibiotic specifically to treat the presence of Clostridium bacteria in the gut, and that individual's psychotic episode remitted. The scientists then collected another urine sample after the remission of the psychotic episode, and the HP-HPA value was noted to decrease. So this really does speak to the idea of the importance of balance and having appropriate amounts of dopamine and norepinephrine as seen by their metabolites on this organic acids test. This is later on in the test. Marker 35 gives us a ratio of HVA to VMA, and it really speaks to this idea that when dopamine beta hydroxylase is inhibited because of the presence of Clostridial bacteria, we get too much dopamine, too much HVA, not enough norepinephrine, and not enough VMA, and speaks to an idea known as basically the dopamine hypothesis around psychosis and schizophrenia. And it's not black and white, it's not straightforward, but the idea there is that too much dopamine leads to these psychotic episodes. Now, what else does the organic acids test do for us? It also gives us insight into how the mitochondria are functioning. The mitochondria are very important. They are one of the most important organelles, essentially small subcomponents of an animal cell, a human cell, that is critical for the production of ATP, which is essentially the cellular currency of energy. By and large, one molecule of glucose will lead to the overall production of 36 molecules of ATP when things are working well. Now, a very small portion of that, 2 molecules of ATP, comes just normally through a process known as glycolysis that happens just in the cell itself. 34 molecules of ATP come about because of the activity of the mitochondria. So we really want our mitochondria to be present in adequate amounts, having everything that they need to do the job that we need them to do so that we have enough ATP, so that we have enough energy to carry on all the activities of life that we need to undertake. We get certain very important markers of how ATP is being produced in the body. In the yellow, we see the glycolysis component, again, responsible for 2 ATP per molecule of glucose. That's important, but it's not nearly as important as how well the mitochondria are functioning. There is a whole component of functional medicine which looks at the mitochondrial theory of aging and chronic disease. And when our mitochondria are not working well, we seem to, quote unquote, age more quickly and deal with more chronic disease. So we get some really good insight into how well the mitochondria are functioning with this test. Now, the bottom component there, 30, 31, and 32, there's some additional functions that the mitochondria undertake and metabolites for which they're responsible that, for the purposes of this conversation, less important, but still an important feature of the test. We also get some nutritional markers on the OAT, different indications of key B vitamins, vitamin C, they call it vitamin Q10, which is basically CoQ10, glutathione precursors and acetylcysteine, biotin. I didn't include it in the webinar, but we actually get a specific assessment on glutathione itself as well. That is the quote unquote master antioxidant of the body. So we really want to have appropriate amounts of glutathione present so that we can stay healthy in terms of the potential for reactive oxygen species and all the problems that they can cause. So that, in a nutshell, is really my review of the organic acids test. Again, it is a very complex test. There is much, much more to it. And I just wanted to provide a bit of an overview of what types of insights could be gleaned from undertaking it. It is a great test to consider right now while we're staying at home, because again, the test collection kits can be drop shipped to you from Great Plains Laboratory or Genova. Again, I mostly use GPL. Samples can be collected at home, frozen, and then shipped back to the company. Results come to me over the internet, and then a telemedicine consultation can be undertaken to review the results. I essentially serve as the tour guide for your particular results when you undertake this type of testing, and help to highlight key areas of significance, as well as go through recommended treatments. Sometimes that would be actually a pharmaceutical agent. If there is an overabundance of Clostridium present, then we're going to want to do something about that. That can be done with antibiotics. It can also be done with herbal interventions. My recommendation often enough is to go with the herbal intervention first, and then we can proceed to antibiotics if the herbal intervention was not strong enough. Oftentimes it is, and if we don't need to essentially wage total war by way of the antibiotics, that would be my preference. But the other really great thing about this test is that we can repeat it after undertaking a treatment to receive, hopefully, a confirmation of cure. So I really do appreciate that aspect of this test as well, because it's easily repeated. In terms of my practice right now, I've mentioned this before. Anyone is available. Anyone is invited to reach out to me for a complimentary 15-minute remote consultation. That is typically used to go through particular supplement recommendations that may be appropriate, whether to help prevent the likelihood of developing COVID-19 or just sort of more of my general recommendations that would be appropriate for anyone. If you are interested in becoming a new patient of mine, we can do that as well. You can avail yourself of the 15-minute complimentary session, or we can do a 30-minute consultation, which would essentially be the first half of a new patient's initial appointment. Anyone who is an existing patient is also, of course, welcome to reach out for the complimentary 15-minute supplement session, or a 30-minute consultation to just follow up with whatever is wanting to be addressed next in your particular situation. For those who are new to my practice, who wish to take advantage of this complimentary 15-minute remote consultation, the other key benefit of doing so is I will create an account for you with the online supplement dispensary that I make use of with all of my patients. This is a company called Fullscript. They carry only pharmaceutical grade supplements. And when you work with me, I provide a 10% discount on their entire catalog of supplements, which is good for your lifetime. Anyone who is a patient of mine, whether existing or wishes to become a new patient, does gain access to a 15% discount on Fullscript's full line of pharmaceutical grade supplements. I've mentioned this as well before, but really the key to my mind with supplements is that you want to be using supplements that come from reputable brands, what I would call pharmaceutical grade brands. This ensures that you are receiving a standardized dose of the particular nutrient that you're interested in taking. You're going to know that you are getting a high quality product that does not contain any extraneous binders, fillers, excipients, things that are going to reduce the overall efficacy of this particular product. I always highlight this feature with my patients. If you're a patient of mine, of course, you are certainly welcome to get whatever supplement you wish from whatever supplier you wish. But I really do want to encourage the use of pharmaceutical grade supplements, which is why I have partnered with Fullscript and why I offer the discounts that I do on their entire catalog. Part of working with Fullscript also is because we can be assured of how the given product has been handled. You can certainly buy the same products from other sources, but FullScript is a reputable purveyor, and we can feel confident that these products have been stored under optimal conditions, that have been turned over frequently enough that they are not past their expiration date, that they have been shipped to you under conditions that will help to promote their overall viability, and that if there is anything unexpected about them, that they got damaged in their shipping, or you took the product and you actually had a poor reaction to it for whatever reason, which can happen, that you can get in touch with their customer service and know that you will be taken care of. Once we move through this current situation of dealing with COVID-19 and physically isolating and staying at home, I will be reopening the practice for in-person consultations for both new and existing patients for both functional medicine and osteopathic treatment. Anyone who is already established at that point can certainly continue to avail themselves of the telemedicine option. Initial appointments with a new patient will need to happen in person, because there's just a component of that initial visit that needs to be done in person, the physical exam. I need to listen to your heart and your lungs and look in your mouth and so forth. It's not invasive, but it's something that does need to happen and can really only happen in person. I will continue to offer the complimentary supplement recommendations to anyone who's interested. I invite you to share that offering with anyone you think might be interested in it. Please also feel free to recommend or suggest that people check out these webinars. I plan to continue hosting them on Tuesdays. Next week, I'm going to be taking a look at advanced cholesterol testing. Generally speaking, the conventional cholesterol or lipid panel that is undertaken by most primary care doctors with their adult patients has its limitations. It can be both falsely concerning as well as falsely reassuring, depending upon what the particular results are. And I'm going to be digging into that dynamic a little bit more specifically next week. Now, this is a blood test, and it's not a finger prick test or a blood spot test, which can be self-taken at home. This is a venipuncture test, basically a needle in the arm to draw out a couple of milliliters of blood so that the test can be undertaken. Labs are open. If you feel comfortable going to a lab, you can certainly do so. My sense is that labs undertaking blood draws are probably some of the most consistently cleaned publicly available spaces currently in our midst. That being said, it is also possible to retain the services of a mobile phlebotomist who will come to your home. Now, there is a little bit of an additional fee for that. So, that would be for individuals who either don't feel comfortable going to a lab or who might be in a higher risk category, maybe have some pre-existing conditions. But the benefit for this advanced cholesterol testing is that we really do get a much more accurate sense of what the future cardiovascular risk is for that individual. And again, I'm going to be going into that more specifically next week. The other really nice aspect of this test is that if we're going to be doing a blood draw, we can also roll into it a micronutrient status evaluation. Some of the specialty companies that do this advanced cholesterol testing also do the micronutrient testing. And I will probably go through that testing maybe the week after next, although that remains to be seen. So I just want to say, once again, thank you so much for your kind attention, for tuning in, for giving me some of your valuable time. If you have any questions at all about this particular webinar, other webinars, if you need citations for any of the research that I mentioned, something else that I haven't mentioned, please get in touch. If you're a patient, you can certainly use the portal system to reach out to me in a secure fashion. You can also give the office a call. You can email me. Our new office hours during COVID-19, Monday through Wednesday, 9 to 3, closed Thursday and Friday, 9 to 12. Before I sign off, I'm just going to check and see if we have any questions that may have been sent in. It doesn't look like it. So with that, I'm just going to say thank you so very, very much once again. I wish you well and stay safe and healthy out there. Okay, bye-bye.